There are friendships that the world sees, and then there are friendships that the world will never fully understand. For over a decade, Elton John and Princess Diana shared something rare, a connection forged not in the glittering halls of power or the spotlight of celebrity, but in the quiet, unguarded moments that neither of them ever allowed the cameras to capture. Now, years after the world lost Diana in the most devastating way imaginable, Elton has finally opened up about the full truth of their bond. The laughter, the silence, the painful falling out, and the reconciliation that came just weeks before fate robbed them of a future together. This is not simply the story of a pop star and a princess. This is the story of two human beings who found in each other something they could find nowhere else: honesty without performance and love without condition. And it is a story that Elton John has carried in his heart for nearly 3 decades, one he can no longer keep to himself. To understand the depth of what Elton John and Princess Diana shared, you first need to understand the worlds they each came from, and how isolating those worlds truly were. By the early 1980s, Elton John was already one of the most recognizable musicians on the planet. He had sold hundreds of millions of records, filled stadiums on every continent, and become synonymous with theatrical, larger-than-life performance. His flamboyant costumes, enormous glasses, and boundless energy made him a spectacle that audiences adored. But beneath all of that glitter and noise was a man deeply uncomfortable in his own skin. Elton struggled with addiction for years, battled profound self-doubt, and lived under the crushing weight of public scrutiny at a time when being a gay man in the entertainment industry carried enormous personal risk. Fame had given him everything the world could offer, and yet it had left him profoundly alone in ways he rarely discussed publicly. Diana Spencer, meanwhile, was about to step into a life that millions of young women across Britain dreamed of, and that she herself would eventually describe as a kind of beautiful imprisonment. She was barely 20 years old when she became engaged to Prince Charles, heir to the British throne. From that moment forward, her every movement, every word, every expression was dissected and judged. The press followed her everywhere. The palace expected perfection. And behind the walls of Kensington Palace, the marriage she had entered with such hope began to unravel almost immediately. She struggled with bulimia. She felt invisible within an institution that valued tradition over the emotional well-being of its members. She was surrounded by people, and yet she was achingly alone. When two people carrying that kind of private pain finally recognize it in each other, the connection that forms is unlike anything else. That is exactly what happened between Elton and Diana, not at some grand royal ceremony, but at a birthday party in the middle of a glittering ballroom with a spontaneous dance and a shared laugh. The year was 1981. Prince Andrew was celebrating his 21st birthday at Windsor Castle, and the great and good of British society had gathered beneath crystal chandeliers to mark the occasion. Elton John had been invited to perform, a nod to his growing acceptance within royal circles, where figures like the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret had already become admirers of his music. But performing for royalty is not the same as belonging among them. By his own admission, Elton felt out of place that evening. He was a working-class boy from Pinner, Middlesex, who had climbed to the top of the world through sheer musical talent and force of personality. Aristocracy was not his natural habitat. He sat at the piano feeling, as he later described it, somewhat adrift in a sea of titles and formality. Then Diana Spencer walked into the room. She was not yet a princess that evening, the royal wedding was still weeks away, but there was something about her presence that was immediately magnetic. Not in an intimidating or regal way, but in the opposite sense. She radiated warmth. She moved through the room with an ease and grace that seemed completely natural, completely unperformed. When she and Elton were introduced, the conversation that followed felt, by his later account, as though they had known each other for years. They talked easily and openly. They laughed at the same things. At some point during the evening, they ended up dancing together in the middle of the ballroom, a spontaneous, joyful, slightly ridiculous Charleston that reportedly drew smiles even from the most reserved guests in the room. It was, Elton has said, the moment he knew this woman was something extraordinary. For Diana, that encounter must have been equally meaningful. In just a matter of weeks, she would become one of the most photographed women on earth, her every public appearance choreographed and scrutinized. That evening at Windsor, she was still simply herself, young, funny, warm, and completely unguarded. Finding that same quality of realness in someone like Elton John, a man who lived his entire life in the public eye and yet had somehow managed to preserve his authentic self beneath all the spectacle, must have felt like a gift. Neither of them could have known that night how deeply their lives were about to intertwine, or how much they would come to need each other in the years ahead. Throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s, Elton and Diana's friendship deepened in the spaces between their public lives. They were both, in different ways, figures of enormous fascination for the world, and yet within the privacy of their friendship, all of that fell away. There were no performances between them. There were no carefully managed appearances. There was simply the kind of honest, sometimes blunt, often hilarious companionship that both of them craved and rarely found elsewhere. Diana attended Elton's charity events regularly, particularly those focused on AIDS awareness, a cause that both of them felt passionate about at a time when the stigma surrounding the disease was still overwhelming. In the mid-1980s, when the AIDS crisis was at its most terrifying and misunderstood peak, Diana did something that shocked the world. She visited AIDS patients in hospital wards, sat with them, held their hands, and embraced them without the protective gloves that fear had made fashionable even among medical professionals. That single act of human compassion did more to shift public perception of AIDS than almost any campaign or advertisement could have achieved. Elton, who had lost close friends to the disease, watched that moment with a depth of admiration he has never been able to fully articulate. It confirmed everything he had already sensed about her, that beneath the princess was a person of genuine, fearless moral courage. Their personal interactions were far lighter in tone, of course. Diana reportedly found endless delight in teasing Elton about his famously extravagant fashion choices. He gave as good as he got, poking fun at the stiff formality of royal life with the irreverence of someone who had absolutely nothing to lose. Elton has described dinner parties and private evenings where Diana would laugh until she cried, where the gossip flowed freely, where the guards came completely down. She had, he has said on multiple occasions, a wonderfully wicked sense of humor that the public rarely got to see. And yet for all the lightness, both of them were also witnesses to each other's darkest periods. As Diana's marriage deteriorated and the newspapers began to publish increasingly painful stories about her personal life, Elton watched from close quarters with growing concern. He knew what it was like to be consumed by public attention in your most private and vulnerable moments. He knew the particular cruelty of having your pain become entertainment for strangers. And Diana, for her part, watched Elton battle his addiction and his struggles with a loyalty and non-judgment that he has said he will never forget. This was the core of what they had, a willingness to see each other fully, without flinching, without judgment, and without ever making the other feel ashamed. By the mid-1990s, Elton and Diana had shared over a decade of genuine friendship. They had been through enough together to feel, perhaps, that their bond was unbreakable. And then something relatively small, and yet emotionally enormous, threatened to sever it entirely. Elton had been working on a charity project, a photography book celebrating rock music culture, with all proceeds earmarked for an AIDS foundation. He asked Diana to contribute a foreword to the book. She agreed. For Elton, this was more than a practical arrangement, it was a deeply meaningful gesture, a fusion of their shared commitment to AIDS awareness and an expression of the trust between them. Having Diana's name and words attached to the project felt, to him, like a powerful statement of solidarity. Then, without any direct conversation, a withdrawal arrived through official channels. Diana's team communicated that she would not be able to participate after all. The reasoning, as Elton came to understand it, related to concerns from Buckingham Palace about the nature of some of the photography in the book, which included images that certain royal advisors found inappropriate for a member of the royal family to be associated with. Elton's reaction was one of genuine hurt. He felt let down, not necessarily by Diana's decision itself, which he could rationally understand was driven by institutional pressure rather than personal choice, but by the manner in which it had been communicated. There had been no phone call. No personal conversation. Just a formal letter that felt cold and distant coming from someone he thought of as one of his closest friends. He expressed his disappointment, she responded with what he has described as a sharp and defensive letter, and then, silence. Months of it. This was a period that Elton has said haunted him most in the years following Diana's death. Not the disagreement itself, which in retrospect seems almost painfully trivial, but the pride on both sides that prevented either of them from simply picking up the phone. He has been honest about the fact that he could have called her and chose not to. She could have called him and did not. They were, he has said, both too stubborn, both too guarded, both too accustomed to protecting themselves from vulnerability even with the people they trusted most. It is a very human failing. And it is perhaps the part of Elton's confession that resonates most deeply, because most of us have had a version of this experience. A misunderstanding left unaddressed. Pride hardening into distance. The slow, terrible realization, usually arriving too late, that time is not the inexhaustible resource we pretend it is. The bridge back to each other came through grief. On a July morning in 1997, the fashion world, and the wider world, were shattered by the news that Gianni Versace had been shot and killed outside his Miami Beach home. Versace was a beloved mutual friend of both Elton and Diana. He had dressed Diana for some of her most iconic public appearances. He and Elton had been close for years. His death was not just a shock, it was a wound. At the funeral service held in Milan, Elton and Diana found themselves in the same space for the first time since their falling out. Diana, according to accounts Elton has shared, crossed the room to where he was sitting and reached for his hand. The words she spoke were simple and direct. She was sorry for the quarrel, she said. It was silly. She wanted them to be friends again. And then, with the timing that only she could manage, she broke the solemnity of the moment with a completely unexpected remark that made him laugh out loud.